The night over the desert was unusually still, as if even time had chosen to remain silent. Beneath a sky filled with distant, indifferent stars, a lone figure stood where the city's noise no longer existed. She was known in stories, whispers, and imagination as Fazza, not as a person defined by titles or ownership, but as a symbol of something far deeper: strength wrapped in silence, beauty hidden in distance, and identity shaped more by perception than reality. She had once lived in a world of towering glass buildings, structured expectations, and invisible roles assigned to her by life, society, and circumstance. From the outside, it had all looked perfect, royal even, but perfection, she had slowly learned, is often just a well-designed illusion hiding quiet emptiness beneath it. She had walked away from that world without drama, without announcement, and without looking back. But what she did not realize at first was that she was not walking away from a place, she was walking out of a version of herself. Every step across the shifting sand felt heavier than the last, not because she was weak, but because she was shedding something she had carried for too long: expectations, identities, names that were never truly hers. The desert did not ask her who she was. It did not demand explanation or justification. It simply accepted her presence, as if it already knew that she had come here not to escape life, but to finally meet it in its rawest form. In the distance, a faint fire flickered beside a solitary traveler, an old man whose face carried the silence of many forgotten journeys. He did not question her arrival. Instead, he looked at her as if he had seen countless souls arrive in the same state: confused, emptied, searching for something they could not name. After a long pause, he finally spoke, not with curiosity, but with understanding. He said that people do not truly leave their stories, they only step out of the versions of the story that no longer belong to them. His words were not loud, but they carried a weight that settled deeply within her, as if something inside her had been waiting years to hear exactly that. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel the need to explain herself. The desert had already begun doing what no city ever had: it was reflecting her back to herself without distortion. The identity she had once carried so tightly began to loosen, not as a loss, but as a release. She started to understand that everything she had thought was external, her name, her role, her meaning, had actually been projections of something internal she had never fully understood. Even the idea of Fazza, once seen as distant and symbolic, no longer felt like something outside her reach. Instead, it transformed into something much more personal: a reminder of what it means to rise, to endure, and to exist beyond definition. As the night deepened, silence grew heavier, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with realization. The traveler by the fire remained quiet, as if he knew that some transformations do not need guidance, only space. She looked at the endless desert around her and realized that emptiness was never absence, it was possibility without shape. For the first time, she understood that leaving her previous world had not been an act of escape, but an act of arrival. She had not been running away from life, she had been running toward its essence. Somewhere within that vast silence, memories of distant lights, towering cities, and unnamed emotions began to dissolve not as pain, but as completion. Everything she had ever experienced was not erased, it was redefined. Even the symbolic presence of Sheikh Hamdan in her thoughts, once a figure of admiration, distance, and inspiration, no longer felt like something unreachable. Instead, it became a reflection of discipline, vision, and strength that had always existed within her understanding of greatness itself. It was no longer about him, or her, or any separation between the two. It was about what such figures represent in the human mind, the idea that greatness is not observed from afar, but cultivated from within. The wind moved gently across the sand, as if turning invisible pages of a story that was finally reaching its conclusion. She closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in acceptance. And in that moment, something profound shifted inside her, not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. When she opened her eyes again, the world had not changed, but her perception of it had. She was no longer standing outside her life, observing it like a spectator. She was inside it now, fully present, fully aware, and no longer divided by identity or expectation. She took a step forward into the desert, not away from anything, but toward everything that remained unwritten. And in that simple movement, something ended and something else quietly began. The story she had once lived as someone defined by others was no more. What remained was something far more powerful, not a title, not a name, not a symbol, but existence itself, unfiltered and free. And so, she did not disappear into the desert. She became part of it. Not lost, not found, but finally whole. The desert did not end where her steps had stopped, it only revealed that it was much larger than what the eyes could understand at first sight. After what felt like both a lifetime and a single breath, she continued walking, though now her movement carried no urgency, no escape, and no confusion. It was as if something inside her had shifted permanently, aligning her with a rhythm that was not emotional anymore but existential. The wind that once felt harsh now moved around her like an old companion, and the sand beneath her feet no longer resisted her presence, it responded to it. Far behind her, the faint light of the old traveler's fire had begun to disappear, not because it was extinguished, but because distance was rewriting its importance. She did not turn back, not out of fear, but because there was nothing pulling her anymore. The past had stopped calling her name, not because it had forgotten her, but because she had finally stopped answering. For the first time, silence was not emptiness, it was clarity. As she walked deeper into the endless desert, she began to notice something unusual. The horizon was no longer fixed, it felt like it was breathing, expanding and contracting with her thoughts. Every memory she had ever carried began to surface not as pain, but as fragments of understanding. She saw moments of her life not as chapters of suffering or joy, but as pieces of a larger design she had never been able to see while living inside it. Even the identity she once held onto so tightly, Fazza, no longer felt like a name given by the world. It felt like a mirror reflecting a version of herself she had been slowly becoming all along. The concept of who she was began to dissolve further, but instead of fear, there was peace. She understood that identity was not a fixed point but a continuous unfolding. The world she had left behind, its cities, its structures, its expectations, no longer existed as something separate. It existed within her now, reshaped by understanding. Even figures she once saw as distant symbols of greatness and inspiration were no longer external references, they had become internal reminders of discipline, ambition, and the human desire to rise beyond limitation. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only moments. Time no longer behaved in a way she could measure. The desert became less like a place and more like a state of mind. And in that state, she realized something profound: she had never truly walked out of her own story. She had only walked out of the illusion that her story was already written. What lay ahead of her was not an ending waiting to be reached, but an infinite beginning waiting to be lived. And so she continued walking, not toward a destination, but into a deeper version of existence itself, where silence spoke louder than words, where emptiness held meaning, and where a person was no longer defined by what they were called, but by what they chose to become. The desert did not consume her. It revealed her. The desert had no beginning that she could remember and no end that she could see. It stretched in every direction like an unfinished thought, infinite and patient. By now, she was no longer counting steps, nor was she searching for direction. Something within her had already surrendered the need to arrive anywhere. The idea of destination had quietly dissolved, leaving only movement, pure, uninterrupted existence. Behind her, everything that once defined her felt distant, not in a painful way, but in a way that made it almost unreal. The city, the lights, the names, the expectations, none of it followed her here. Even memories that once carried emotional weight now felt like they belonged to someone she used to know, not someone she still was. It was not loss. It was release. She stopped walking at a point where the wind felt still for the first time. The silence here was different. It was not empty, it was complete. As she stood there, she finally understood what the old traveler had never fully explained. People do not walk out of their own stories to escape them. They walk out when the story they are living no longer matches the truth they are becoming. Her name Fazza no longer felt like something given to her by the world. It felt like something she had passed through, like a stage of becoming rather than an identity to hold. It was no longer a label. It was a memory of transformation. And in that realization, something inside her settled permanently. The wind moved gently across the desert, as if acknowledging her silence. She closed her eyes, not to shut the world out, but to finally feel it without resistance. There was no fear left in her now, no confusion, no search for approval or meaning outside herself. Everything she had been looking for had quietly shifted inward. When she opened her eyes again, nothing around her had changed, but she had. The desert was still endless, the sky still wide, the world still vast and unknown. Yet for the first time, none of it felt overwhelming. It felt like possibility. She took one final step forward, not away from anything, not toward anything, but simply because movement was now her nature. And in that step, something quietly ended and something infinitely larger began. She was no longer a girl who walked out of her own story. She had become the story itself. And the desert kept her secret forever.